Thersites the Historian here. Today I'd like to take a look at the life of Oda Nobunaga, one of the major figures from medieval Japanese history. Now, the reason why I got interested in him in the first place is because of the game on your screen and others like it. I played a lot of Koei games, and those games typically either cover the Three Kingdoms era of China or the Sengoku period of Japanese history. I know quite a bit about the Three Kingdoms period, and I'll make videos about that later, but for now I figured it might be nice to delve into the Japanese Sengoku period, and I'm going to do that by making a series of 3 videos about Nobunaga, then Hideyoshi, and then Tokugawa Ieyasu. So without further ado, let's talk about Nobunaga. The Oda clan was from Owari province, pictured here on your map. This province was both fertile and centrally located, something which really helped to offset the relatively low birth of Nobunaga and set him up for success. This is Gifu Castle, a territory taken by Nobunaga's father Nobuhide, and the place where Nobunaga would govern in his earliest years as a ruler. There are conflicting stories about what young Nobunaga was like. One of them says that he learned how to use guns at a fairly young age and really began to mentally process the potential of firearms in an age when most warfare in Japan was still conducted by bows and spears. So in that tradition, he is someone who was thinking ahead and was always the conquering Nobunaga that we know from history. On the other hand, there's also a tradition in Japan that Nobunaga was wayward and that during his first several years as ruler, he mostly pursued his own pleasures and ignored affairs of state, until one day when he was lounging about in the hills, he was visited by his father Nobuhide, who chided him for wasting his potential and not advancing the interest of the Oda clan, upon which Nobunaga promptly reformed and became a great soldier. At either rate, he ultimately would go on to become a great soldier, and that's why this video is being made. Nobuhide died in 1551, leaving a 15-year-old Nobunaga in charge. Nobunaga did not really command much respect or confidence in his chief adherents, and some of them decided to back his brother in order to advance their own power. Nobunaga's younger brother was named Nobuyuki, and they fought a civil war for several years, at the end of which Nobunaga actually ended up pardoning most of Nobuyuki's supporters, but he had Nobuyuki eliminated. So he showed a ruthlessness early on that became a major characteristic of his rule throughout his entire life. In 1558, as he continued to struggle to establish himself in the Owari province, Nobunaga happened to recruit a man who would become one of his chief generals. This man was also known for diplomacy and for designing castles. History knows him as Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and we'll talk more about him later. But in this video, suffice it to say that many of the deeds that we attribute to Nobunaga were made possible by the generalship and efforts of Hideyoshi and other important officers. In 1560, with his power over Owari freshly established, Nobunaga first made his name on the national scene. That year, 1560, a general named Imagawa Yoshimoto invaded Owari on his way to Kyoto. He seemed to have a large army and he had a lot of ambitions. Now, Nobunaga was massively outnumbered, however, he didn't panic, and he waited for Imagawa to move into a gorge in his home territory, which he, of course, knew well. Then Nobunaga cut off the gorge and butchered this large army of Imagawa. The defeat was so thorough that within 10 years, all of the surviving lands of the Imagawa family had been gobbled up by people such as Tokugawa and the Takeda family. Speaking of Tokugawa, young Tokugawa had been a fairly minor warlord to the east of Nobunaga, and he had been forced to fight against Nobunaga in some of the early wars in that region. However, after Akihazama, Tokugawa became an ally of Nobunaga, and they remained allies for the rest of their lives. Obviously, Tokugawa is a famous name, and in a subsequent video, we'll talk about exactly why he was vital. For Nobunaga, however, Tokugawa was one of his most loyal allies, and it is very hard to imagine Nobunaga doing what he did without the support of Tokugawa. Nobunaga's sister Uichi was a famous beauty in Japan at this period, and she was one of the keys to getting Nobunaga to Kyoto. He had to get through rivals who were in between him and the capital, and he defeated them by a combination of military force and diplomacy. One of them he enticed with his sister Uichi. Once he arrived in the capital, he deposed the sitting shogun and replaced him with a young man who had come to him as a refugee named Ashikaga Yoshiaki, one of the other relatives of the Ashikaga family. Now, in theory, what happens is the emperor rules, but the shogun rules on behalf of the emperor, and in this period it had gotten to the point where the Ashikaga shogunate functioned a lot like the emperorship in the sense that they were puppets of other people. So effectively, Nobunaga was ruling for the emperor through a shogun who was also a figurehead, if that makes sense. I hope that isn't too confusing. And apparently, although I'm by no means an expert on this, there is some controversy where people say that the emperors during this period actually did have and exercised real power. However, I don't know enough to comment any further on that other than to point out that there is a debate about it. Nobunaga had established Yoshiaki in 1568, and now he was seeking to secure his position in Kyoto, and to that end he took a number of steps and had to wage several major conflicts. One of his first steps was to build Gifu Castle, something that he had conquered on the path from Owari to Kyoto, and this remained his base of operations for quite a while he still needed to have easy access to Owari, and his position in Kyoto was not super secure. Gifu Castle became one of his, sort of iconic locations. As luck would have it, the area around Kyoto was more heavily populated by strong villages and men who lived in them named samurai, who were semi-independent cultivators who were not necessarily beholden to a powerful feudal lord. And Nobunaga was pretty successful at cultivating the loyalty of these men, and they would continue to fill the ranks of his armies throughout his career, and they normally didn't provide him with too many challenges or revolts, so that was one thing that he took care of pretty early on from 1568 forward. And this was almost certainly helped by the fact that he himself was not from one of the super powerful houses, at least super powerful in the sense of by birth, and that he had promoted people from the bottom such as Hideyoshi. However, the lack of a powerful local daimyo did not necessarily mean the lack of an organized and powerful opposition. In Nobunaga's time and in the Kyoto area, there were very powerful Iko sects of Buddhism. Now, these are basically warrior monks who were fiercely independent and also were powerful and organized enough to actually expand their territory, so they weren't merely passive. Nobunaga, as a state builder and conqueror, was intent upon conquering them, and he fought them for the rest of his life. It was only in actually 1580 that this process seems to have basically come to a conclusion, and it was only after many, many lives were lost and Nobunaga had practiced quite a bit of brutality against these Buddhist monks that he brought them to heel. I have to imagine that much of the negative tradition about Nobunaga stems from the fact that he had such a bad relationship with Buddhists like this. A large part of the reason why he couldn't focus on the subjugation of the Iko and other local threats is because Nobunaga was also distracted by the threat of more distant warlords getting their acts together and marching on him in force. The most formidable of these warlords was named Takeda Shingen. Now, for the most part, Tokugawa was holding off Shingen in the east, but Shingen became powerful enough that he managed to inflict a defeat on the combined forces of Nobunaga and Tokugawa at one point. However, before Shingen could follow up and fight a full-scale war, which would have really endangered Nobunaga, he died, and he left his lands to his less capable son. Many of Nobunaga's rivals, such as Shingen, were inspired to act against him by the intrigues and efforts of the shogun, Yoshiaki, the same man Nobunaga had installed as shogun. So accordingly, Nobunaga marched on him and drove him from Kyoto. Yoshiaki would continue to advocate for anti-Nobunaga alliances, and he was successful in getting some people to attack Nobunaga or to send supplies to eco rebels. However, for the most part, Yoshiaki's career was effectively over after he was driven from Kyoto in 1573. That same year in 1573, Nobunaga also completely eliminated the houses of Asai and Asakura and confiscated their lands for redistribution among his chief followers, such as Tokugawa and Akechi. In July of 1574, Nobunaga surrounded and then burned the eco-stronghold of Nagashima, and this resulted, of course, in the complete annihilation of everyone there. This is one of the acts for which Nobunaga is most famous, and it is probably the prime example people would cite when they are trying to explain how and why he is one of the most ruthless men of his age. In June of 1575, Nobunaga's most iconic battle occurred when the younger Takeda led his army of 30,000 men to face Nobunaga and Tokugawa, and this resulted in the Battle of Nagashino. Now what happened is that Tokugawa and Nobunaga were afraid of the fabled Takeda cavalry, and they themselves did not have nearly as many horsemen. So they set up a stockade and put their musketmen behind it. By this point, Nobunaga had trained, equipped, and drilled at least 3,000 or so musketmen. And the Takeda cavalry attacked in 4 waves, and they were effectively slaughtered by Nobunaga's tactics, where he made up for the slow firing speed of the muskets by having them work in lines. Nobunaga's men lost virtually no one, whereas the Takeda army was shattered horribly. And just like with Asakura and Asai before, the remaining territories of the Takeda were gobbled up by Nobunaga and his followers. Aside from the recurring threat of the Eco sects, another major threat during this period was Usugi Kenshin, an old rival of Takeda Shingen, and now someone who wanted to challenge Nobunaga. Now, he was trying to move on Nobunaga, and he had an army in motion, but bad weather stopped them in 1577. He was going to go, into full campaign mode for the spring of 1578. However, he died of a brain hemorrhage at slightly less than the age of 50, and his plans completely fell apart, thus sparing Nobunaga what was sure to have been a pretty involved war. In April of 1580, Nobunaga finished an 11-year siege when Kosa, the leader of the Honganji, decided to surrender to Nobunaga after his supplies had run out. For years, Nobunaga had been tightening the grip on the Honganji, and now they finally capitulated to the will of Nobunaga. So this means that he had effectively eliminated all organized resistance from groups like the Honganji and the Eco sects, and he had basically rid his territories of hostile internal factions who were not subject to the will of the state led by him. So this is more or less the peak of Nobunaga's power. The only remaining threat to Nobunaga came from the Mori family in the west, who had strong ties to pirates, had inflicted one major naval defeat on Nobunaga, and had been supplying the Eco sects in the Honganji by sea for several years. When the Mori clan declared official war in 1582, Nobunaga decided to personally lead the campaign, but that campaign was not to be for reasons we'll get into momentarily. During the summer of 1582, as Nobunaga continued to organize and mobilize his large army to fight Mori, he traveled to Kyoto to spend the night, and while he was there, he was surrounded by the troops of one of his generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, and he was murdered. It is unclear whether he died by his own hand or if, ironically, like many of the Buddhist monks he had killed, he died because the enemy set fire to his building. At any rate, Nobunaga was eliminated, and this sparked a new round of civil wars. We'll get into that when we talk about Hideyoshi, and we're also going to do a specific video just about Akechi, since I feel like he and his plot are worthy of a video, and we're coming up on the anniversary of that plot since June 21st is just around the corner. So back to Nobunaga, who is now dead. While the name Oda Nobunaga primarily conjures military images in the minds of most people, the fact is that he was just as innovative and important in other aspects of governance. From the time that he first entered Kyoto and began to govern the country in 1568, Nobunaga was interested in currency reform. He made standard measurements for copper, silver, and gold coins, and tried to regulate the relationship between those forms of currency. In addition, Nobunaga was a supporter of free trade. Now, not in the modern ideological neoliberal sense, but in the sense that he wanted to disallow other people to collect harbor dues and market fees and thus create alternate sources of political power. This free market approach for Nobunaga also served the purpose of encouraging the flow of goods to his lands, and hopefully encouraged people like gun makers and others who were important to war making to settle in his territories and be benevolently minded to his own regime. One of Nobunaga's final and finest achievements was the construction of Sushi Castle. This was a major undertaking which required a ton of resources, but what it did do was defend the northern approaches to Kyoto, since Kyoto was most vulnerable to attack from the north, which is exactly the reason why Nobunaga had been so fearful of some of his previous rivals, and so eager to reduce the Iko and other rivals who could possibly aid them in that quarter. As we mentioned earlier, Nobunaga was one of the first people to seize upon the tactical importance of the musket and its superiority to more traditional means of fighting. Nobunaga was not necessarily the primary innovator of this. Actually, the Iko sects were among the first to use this, and because Nobunaga spent a lot of time fighting them, he no doubt adapted that and had learned quite a bit after 7 years of fighting them, and that may have been what inspired his tactics at Nagashino, where he used muskets to great effect. The effect of Nobunaga's military reforms effectively rendered the mounted warriors who had repelled the Mongol invasions a few hundred years before more or less obsolete, as now it was clear that gunpowder was the way of the future. Not only did Nobunaga employ his musketeers intelligently, but he also built up the institutional apparatus by which he could continue to recruit such troops and use them as effectively as possible. He drilled them and developed armor to protect them and serve their specific needs. So he also worked on formations that could allow musketeers to most fully utilize their firepower. So Nobunaga really thought this through, and he went about his use of musketry very thoroughly. This was not just some guy who put out some guys with guns and won. This took a lot of effort, and it shows a great deal of imagination and organizational skill. Nobunaga had not united Japan by the time of his death in 1582. However, his efforts were the best that Japan had seen in many centuries, and it was, of course, his followers in the subsequent years after his death who were able to achieve his dream and create a united and ultimately peaceful Japan. This is an imagined portrait of Nobunaga drawn by a Jesuit missionary a few years after he died. This missionary had personally never met Nobunaga, by the way. But the reason I bring this up is because we're trying to imagine what Nobunaga as a man was like in our final segment here. And the truth is that it seems like he was probably a pretty terrible guy. Even in a very ruthless age, Nobunaga's ruthlessness really stood out. As I mentioned earlier, he burned to death the survivors at Nagashima. Further, he really did a lot of other things they didn't have to do. When he was fighting the Eco, he not only hunted men, but he also allowed for the slaughter of women and children. When he took the capital of the province of Echizen, he bragged that he killed so many people that the corpses were really clogging all the streets and that the city was virtually impassable. It's not surprising, given his hostility towards the Buddhists who were literate and producing text, that most of the character assessments of him are extremely negative in our sources. And even the Christian sources, especially the Jesuit missionaries from the West, are a little lukewarm, even though he made a lot of efforts to really kiss up to them. They still say that he was a, pretty ruthless and bloodthirsty guy. So he's not the kind of person who should be really held up as an example of humanity. However, he was an important state builder, and his efforts ultimately did help end some of the chaos and fighting in Japan, which led to the more peaceful and settled and prosperous era that followed.